Malo Elele, and greetings to each and every one of you. Welcome to Lo'auanism University. I'm Professor Siosiua Lafitani. We'll be talking in the next half an hour in this topic entitled Sydney Realism, or the philosophy of Sydney Realism to Atenisi University and Lo'auanism or Lo'auanism University. So this is part one, and the series will go from part one to part five, and then we'll see from there how we go. Actually, what I would like to do in this series is to talk about the educational philosophy of the Sydney Realism in Sydney University, and how their educational philosophy is connected to Atenisi University in the Kingdom of Tonga and Lo'auanism University, which I have used the term Lo'auanism. Lo'auanism is the name of the entire movement. So I will look particularly at the philosophy, educational philosophy, and how it's connected, or how it has connected these three movements, these three educational movements or universities for that matter. And I will additionally talk also, apart from various issues related issues, but I will talk also about the intellectual genealogy or genealogies among these three educational institutions. So we have the Sydney Realism, which was founded by Professor John Anderson of the Sydney University. He came from Scotland in 1927 or 26, and working, and was a philosopher teaching at the. He taught philosophy at the University of Sydney from 1927 until he retired and died in 1962. Atenisi University was founded by Professor Elisa Fudahelu, and he was a student of John Anderson at Sydney University and within the School of Sydney Realism in the 1950s, and he returned before John Anderson died, and started, or around the same time, and started in Tonga, the Atenisi Institute, with the divisions of the Atenisi University, high school, and the technical school. And later on, the performing arts, the Atenisi Performing Arts, FPA. And Lo'au University, or the Lo'auanism, where I started with a few Tongan academics. Professor Inoke Fotuakau, who was also a student of, former student of Professor Fudahelu, and Inoke was also at Sydney University studying under the Department of Philosophy, where John Anderson and Professor Fudahelu, where John Anderson was teaching, or the mentor of the Sydney and professor, teacher of the Sydney Realism within the Department of Philosophy. And Inoke was studying there, doing his master in philosophy, and Futa as well was a student, as I said. But Inoke was a student there later on in the 1980s, and he completed his master from there in philosophy. So Inoke was one of the founders of Lo'au University, and he was the president of Lo'au Research Society, which was the first educational movement that we formed, mainly by Atenisi ex-students from the Atenisi alumni in Australia, New Zealand, and Tonga in 1999. But I will come back to that as I continue in discussion the philosophy, educational philosophy of these three institutions or movements in association to the idea or the notion of intellectual genealogy. So another founder, among the founders of Lo'au University is Professor Malakai Kolomatangi, Professor Augustino Mahina, Professor Terita Kaili, in the beginning of Lo'au University and before the Lo'au University, when it was still a Lo'au Research Society. Just a few names, as I recall, coming to mind: Kirk Huffman from the Sydney Museum, and also Professor Starik Finau, Professor Elias Offa, Luisa Latu Kefu, and Seuri Kerep, Seuri Mafi, and a few others for founding the Lo'au University. But as I partly mentioned before, there was the Lo'au Research Society that we formed before the establishment of Lo'au University in 2011. Lo'au Research Society, it's an offshoot of Lo'au University initially, was started or was founded in 1999. And the founding members were mostly Atenisi ex-students, as I said, from the Atenisi alumni of New Zealand and Australia. And I would like to mention a few names like Benilangi, Kintoni Mafi, the Honorable Lord Tuiafitu in Tonga, Professor Augustino Mahina, Professor Inoke Fotuakau was the president of the Lo'au Research Society, and we have Elisia Deika, Sao Slavaka, and a few other. Professor Max Rimodi. Max Rimodi was studying with Professor Fudahelu under the Sydney, under the mentor of Professor John Anderson at the Sydney realism. And I will bring some of the names as I continue on, but Lo'au Research Society was formed in 1999, and from there to 2011, and then Lo'au Research Society was formed in 2011 and up to now. And it is basically an online higher learning system, which is conducted and directed from Canberra and Sydney, but its headquarters is situated in Pahu, at the capital of Nuku'alofa in the Kingdom of Tonga. But let me go back to Sydney Realism. Mind you about the title of the series. The series part 1, the philosophy of Sydney Realism, or from Sydney Realism and its philosophy to Atenisi and Lo'auanism, or Lo'au University in Tonga. The educational, let it put it this way, we'll go back to touch base on something about Sydney Realism. First of all, Sydney Realism was formed under Professor John Anderson and his students and followers. In 1927, he became a chair of what it's called Charles Chair of Philosophy at Sydney Uni, and John Anderson was appointed or elected as the chairperson. I think it's 1930 or 32, but he became the chair, and he was a lecturer and a researcher at the department, and he was very controversial, but he moved from Scotland with some new conceptions to philosophy, and he was very popular among students on one hand, because of his new theoretical and philosophical conceptions about philosophy. And at the time, he was still very conservative here in Australia, and the main universities, or the first universities at the time, was the Sydney University and Melbourne University. And John Anderson came in a time where philosophy here in Australia was still small and frail, and hadn't solidified itself at the time. So he was in Scotland. He was studying. John Anderson was studying under the Hegelians, with the Hegelian philosophy, and he was initially, as a student of the Hegelianism, he was a young Hegelian when he was at the university, but when he moved to the University of Sydney, John Anderson found a new land, a new atmosphere, a new environment. Sydney University was new for him. It was still a growing academic institution. At the time, life was still under the colonial British Empire. So there were a few fundamental new things, new changes in the Sydney industrial environment for John Anderson. However, he, apart from all these complicated and new factors, new environment, he gradually began to develop this philosophy, which is later on known as Sydney Realism or the Australian Realism, which a philosophy. Sydney Realism and John Anderson and his schools and his students is a philosophy that at the time was and is still was based on the realist view to education. So realism generally emphasizes, focuses on the consideration and taking of any issue under investigation, firstly as an occurrence happening in spatial temporality or temporal spatiality, on one level of existence, and the knowledge, the truth, the validity of that particular given issue is based on its own terms and not in the personal or subjective likeness or taste of the investigator or the researcher. That is the basis, the fundamental basis of realism. It's not the consideration of knowledge in the light of how I believe or how my mind perceives it, but the consideration of any issue in its own terms, in its own objective nature, how its mode of operation works in reality on one level of existence, not on different levels, which is known as rationalism, on different level of knowledge, or not. Knowledge is not based, or reality is not based on how my mind perceives things or how I believe, but knowledge, truth, and validity of things in reality are based. They are all based and built upon in their own characters, in their own characteristics, in their own nature, and it's an outcome of how the investigator or the subject or the researcher struggle and confront all obstacles in the research environment that may hinder and may become obstacles to his endeavor to account the nature, account the characters, the truth, and the valid values of a particular issue or particular proposition in its own right. And that's the heart. That's the essence of the doctrine of realism, where Sydney realism was and is still based on that conception, on that theoretical or philosophical conception. Sydney realism under John Anderson and his school, Sydney University, take all fields of study to be based on philosophical or philosophic principles, not on scientific, but on philosophy. Philosophy is the main theoretical judgment to be used when you conduct or do any research in any particular given area. So it's not science in accordance to Sydney realism, and it's not science, but philosophy in the guiding tool of logic. That's the heart. That's the essence of Sydney realism, and I think I have touched, and I have elaborated enough, sufficient perspective on that, on the importance of Sydney realism and Professor John Anderson and the Sydney realism. And as we continue, I will come back and clarify and talk further about other related issue. And I will start. I'm just highlighting today, because this is the first part, Sydney realism, Atenisi, and then Lo'auanism or Lo'au University. I'll now come to Atenisi University. Atenisi University, under the founder, Professor Fudahelu, as I mentioned, was studying under John Anderson at Sydney University in 1950s. And he was studying philosophy, literature, physics, and English, English literature, and other fields of study, but these were his main subjects at the university. And Professor Fudahelu, while he was a student there, he didn't finish any undergraduate degrees. He didn't receive any degree at all. He was there for about 4 years, and then as a student of John Anderson, and he was well known to his generational mate at the time, and then he left for Tonga. I think was 62 or 61 that he left for Tonga before John Anderson, Professor John Anderson died. Fuda went back, and what he was doing in Tonga was laying the foundation to start Atenisi University or Atenisi Institute with its division of university, high school, and technical school. Fuda was a real student follower of John Anderson. He brought the Sydney realism the philosophy of Sydney Realism, the whole philosophy with him, and started Atenisi with the whole philosophical concept or conception of John Anderson. He named his institute Atenisi, is a Tongan for Athens in Greece. It's a reflection of the great influence of John Anderson and his profound interest on the Greek philosophers and the Greek culture, Roman and the Greco-Roman civilization and life of education. All these general interests of Anderson was apparently very obvious and stood out in his own academic and social life at Sydney University and Sydney Realism with the students and within here in Australia. So Professor Futahelo went back, and he was already rooted, and his academic life was already formulated and structured with the main conceptions, the main way of life of a Sydney realists, or a Sydney philosophy student, under the mentor and teacher and guidance of John Anderson. So Atenisi in Tonga is a true and real product of the Sydney Realism. There was nothing much new that Futa brought to Tonga, but most, if not all, were philosophical ideas or philosophical and theoretical conceptions in various different fields of studies from deriving from John Anderson and the Sydney Realism. So Futa brought Sydney Realism into the kingdom and implanted and watered it and nurtured it and tried to make it grow healthy and to grow up, this seed of the Sydney Realism based on the field of philosophy, everything to be based on philosophy in the Greek and the Western sense of the term. So all Futa did in his early days in Tonga when Atenisi was started, after Atenisi was started, is to make sure that the seed of the philosophical and educational philosophy of the Sydney Realism would be growing in a fertile way. Futa didn't have some new ideas at the time. As I said, the ideas that he started Atenisi with were all from John Anderson and Sydney Realism. Futa applied the Sydney Realism and its educational philosophy into the study of Tongan culture and Tongan society and politics and so forth. And nothing new there, nothing new, all Andersonian ideas, but it was new at the time because no one in Tonga knew about that, all these new and amazing ideas. They didn't know they were all from Sydney Realism and John Anderson. But further really know in the beginning of Atenisi how to use them to build a very new and unique environment, educational educational institution in the kingdom. So as we come, and then Atenisi was slowly, gradually growing. 1967, the 66 started, 67, I think, or 68. The university division was begun to be developed, and in the early 70s, there were first 73, I think, in which Professor Inoka Fotuakau was one of the first Associate of Arts with a graduate with one of the graduates with Associate of Arts from the university, Atenisi University. So I was a student there in the 80s. I graduated from Atenisi, and among the founding members of Lo'au University or Lo'auanism, most of us or all of us were, some of us were at Atenisi University, some were not, but like Professor Malakai Kolomatangi, Professor Tarek Finau, and others, we all, in one way or another, had some intellectual and social connections and interaction and affiliations with Professor Futa, whether we were students of Futa or not, but we were all, Tongan scholars being influenced by the philosophy of Atenisi, which and adopted, and the philosophy developed, which was adopted from the educational philosophy of the Sydney Realism. But we were all influenced in one way or another by the educational philosophy of Atenisi in Tonga and by Professor Futahelo. And here we are. We started the Lo'au Research Society in 1999, and some of us decided to continue on and establish Lo'au University. And others decided to start it, like Professor Agustina Mahina, who they were with us when we started the Lo'au Research Society. But when it came to 2011, some of us decided to continue and establish the Lo'au University. Some decided to establish other academies, like the Tongan International Academies, the Vava'u Academies. Vava'u Academy and Tongan International Academy were both started by Dr. William Waske, Professor Agustina Mahina, Professor David Kaili, Dr. Robin Havea, among others. But like Dr. Robin Havea and Dr. William Waske Latut, both of them were also founding members of the Lo'au Research Society before we decided to go different ways, and then we started the Lo'au Research Society, and then they started the Tongan International Academy and Vava'u Academy. So, but these are offshoots from the Atenisi University by Professor Futahela. And I think with this introduction and this general overview of the title of this series, of this part one, which is focus, and the examination of the philosophy from Sydney University to Atenisi University and Lo'au University or Lo'auanism. I would like to thank you very much for your time. We'll continue next time to part 2, but feel free to drop in some questions and I'll try my best to respond in the second part. Malo abito of layat.